And we are live. This is the latest episode of The Dictators, which is a weekly live stream that I do with my co-host, Jonathan Fink from Silicon Curtain. And we try to have some of the best, the most leading experts on the critical issues of the day with us every week. We certainly have one today. So let's launch right into it. Today, we have a very special guest in Piotr Kurzin. He is a geopolitical analyst. He specializes in all things Russian. He, in the recent past, has focused primarily on the war in Ukraine, where Russia invaded in, of course, 2022. But like the rest of the world, he's been concentrating over the last, how long is it now, 12, 13 days on the war in Iran, and unfortunately, the war that the United States, my country, launched. So we're probably going to spend the bulk of the live stream talking about that. So, Piotr, let's get it started. First of all, welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think it's been a couple of years since I joined you, David. You were kind enough to invite me. I think when you were bigger than me, and now I'm reaching 130,000 subscribers, which is kind of nuts. We largely focus on the war in Ukraine, but my channel deviates a little bit, and I try to focus on themes as well. So what connects the war in Iran to what's happening in the war in Ukraine, which we'll obviously come to, but also economics and conflict. So the great power competition, if you like. So it's quite multifaceted if people want to check it out. But it's good to be back with you and to be back chatting with Jonathan of Silicon Curtain as well.
Well, you're right. It's been about a year and a half or two. And you're also right. I think I had more subscribers than you did. But of course, what happened was I taught you everything I know. So your channel was then.
I learned a lot from you. I certainly did. I'm
still waiting for the commission check. So any time is good. I'll give you the address.
That is cheeky. That's very cheeky.
I've been having a busy week with business setups and stuff. So absolutely, I will forward you that in the mail shortly.
Let me just
send green shield stamps. Your
YouTube is at the Global Gambit, correct? At the Global Gambit.
And the name of the podcast is the Global Gambit, but I called my channel my name because I felt that would be a better way to.
And that's Piotr Kurzin at Substack or .substack.
Yeah. People could just type in my name there. I've been on the news now. I crazy month. I was in the BBC. I've been on Sky. It was pretty nuts. So I'm not trying to showboat. I'm just trying to sort of. It's hard to get your head around those sorts of opportunities, but the podcast is the Global Gambit, so if people want to listen to it, I try to mix the perspectives within reason, because I think it's important to
plug everything you can here. We're all about that, so don't worry.
We've got that up on the screen, and I should have called.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, we go. Folks, go there. It's worth it.
We know where the buttons are. David's got an excellent Substack.
I want to open up with one question only about Russia, because I do want to spend the bulk of the live stream about what's going on in Iran. There's been a lot of attention for folks that are still paying attention and analyzing what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, with rumors about a coup. A palace coup. There's always rumors about a coup in the Kremlin. I get that. But I guess what people on fire recently is that, and this is true, Moscow, the Kremlin in Moscow has cut off, for the most part, internet access to mobile carriers, mobile phones in Moscow. And now I understand St. Petersburg, which is a first. And many of those people have not had access on their cell phones, their mobile phones, for over a month, in some cases 2 months. Do you think that has anything to do with Putin's fear, his paranoia about his leading officers, the intelligence services, or anyone plotting against him? Or is this a technical glitch? They're trying to get their new internet or their new social media platform, Max, to be used by everyone? Or what are your thoughts on that? What's going on with this alleged coup and no internet access from Moscow and St. Petersburg?
Sure. So firstly, I would say that given my primary attention on the geostrategic implications of the war in Iran. I haven't been as up to date with the situation in Ukraine, or more specifically the Russian economy. Those are the two main things that I probably look at. I don't look at the micro granular details of the day-to-day military analysis. I think there's fantastic coverage of that already, including by Jonathan. I look at the structural shifts, the big picture, if you like. And in this regard, I mean, you know, I've just, in the time that you were describing it, I've just looked on Kiev Independent, which is a Ukrainian publication, so we have to keep that in mind. But it also comes from British tabloids. So British tabloids, are they a dependable source of consistent information? They have been true in the past. But what makes me skeptical of this is the fact that it's sort of to do with Sergei Shoigu. So Shoigu is the former defense minister of the Russian government, and he sort of was reallocated in a lateral move to the Security Council or whatever. But I find that rather... Well, I've never taken Shoigu very seriously, to be honest with you. Yes, he's one of Putin's closest confidants, and they have a good personal relationship. But the idea that I could imagine the Russian Federation being led by him is absurd, because I just don't think he has what it takes. I think he lacks the sort of the grit or a certain hardline view that Putin has. From my understanding of people that I used to know in the Russian sphere, you know, he's not the most brainy of people, and I think that his short-termist, more focused approach on things would miss the forest for the trees, if that makes sense. Putin, whether you like him or not, is quite good at thinking about how to manipulate Trump to his benefit or something like that. So I personally think that Shoigu doesn't have what it takes. If you want to talk about a post-Putin Russia, I look at someone like Petrushev. You know, I think he's much more of a mindset that follows on and would be a good continuation of Putin and Putinism, if you like. So certainly, though, and the broader point about mobile outages, yes, that is true. The Kremlin have been imposing restrictions increasingly more as the war has endured, as the Ukrainians have undertaken, you know, remarkable strikes further into the Russian motherland, the heartland, taking out infrastructure. And in my opinion, I think that this is a real. If the Russians are doing this, it's because they either want to suppress information, as we saw with the internet shut off of the Iranians in January, or because the damage is so severe that they don't actually have a choice. So either way, it's not great for Moscow. It doesn't portray this idea of protector, provider that Putin likes to emphasize, that he is, everything's hunky-dory at home. And I think from the few Russian friends that I still can limitedly speak to, there's definitely a growing sense of the war coming home more in the city centers. You know, if this was 18 months ago, 15 months ago, there would have been this idea that the biggest urban centers are relatively sheltered from the conflict, and it is mainly affecting rural areas or the immediate borders in Kursk Oblast or something like that. So I think that this is a notable thing, but do I think that there's an emerging palace coup that's going to be successful? Not really. And even if there was, I don't think Shoigu would be at the head of it, because I think there's much better placed people to do it. But that's, you know, I don't know what you think. Do you think it's there's any truth to it?
I mean, I was going to say he's not got the intelligence background. I think we have to sort of say whoever replaces Putin is very likely to come from from the FSB Siloviki structure, simply in order to survive. I mean, as you say, Shoigu doesn't have what it takes for that level of brutality, but also the connections, the trust, and so on.
He lacks intelligence in both the professional sense and the personal sense. I think
personal sense, yeah.
I'm just going to add that you're right.
Yeah. What he did to the Russian military I think he took over in 2013. And it was a mess, what he did with the Russian restructuring. A complete mess. So anyway.
That's why they brought in a Soviet economic apparatchik to try and sort it out.
Precisely, right?
You know? Yeah,
exactly.
But also,
I agree. I don't think there's a coup in the progress here. I just, like I said, I do follow that. I try to, follow what's going on in the Kremlin and Moscow, as well as what's going on in Iran. And the people that do follow that are all on fire about this alleged coup happening because of the outages with the mobile phones. And there may be something to that. I believe it's what you said, though, Piotr. It's mostly because they want to prohibit those that in Moscow and St. Petersburg from getting as much outside information as possible. Although they all use VPNs, but still.
If I can just add one last point quickly. I think, we all want the war for Russia to not be doing what it is doing. And I think that it's good to focus on these growing disruptions, right? The disruptions to daily life for Russians. The coup thing, I think, just takes it a little bit far. I think that's more the wishful thinking of people who are pretty, looking for any sign that the Kremlin is about to implode, which, as much as I'd like to see Putin out of the picture, it's just not realistic. But we should certainly not undermine the significance of these disruptions, because it shows the growing inability to keep the mask on, right? That everything's perfectly fine, the Russian economy is brilliant. Clearly it's not, and we should definitely focus on that.
Well, I love anything that pisses off the average Russian person, so I'm all for it anyway.
It does perhaps attest to Putin's paranoia, though, or it may be that they're planning a large-scale mobilization of some sort, and they need to prepare the ground in order to make sure that whatever happens, and I think, Piotr, I agree with you, it's unlikely there's going to be some large-scale protest, because if there hasn't been already, unlikely now, and many of the people who would have perhaps protested have either left the country or are, alas, securely locked up somewhere in a grim Siberian cell. But that doesn't mean the Kremlin isn't paranoid. It doesn't mean they're not looking and thinking there might be some kind of coup under every rock. That's certainly
for sure. Putin has undertaken mini purges frequently throughout in the 4 years since 22, and even during his tenure as Tsar, let's just call it what it is. He's undertaken this quite a few times, especially after the Georgian War in 2012, after what the West calls the Snow Revolution, in the massive protest when he amended the constitution to give himself basically limitless terms. There's definitely a paranoia within Putin. And the last thing I'd say, you've hosted Mark Galotti. I've chatted with him as well, Jonathan. And one of the things he said to me ages ago, which I really liked, was about these different minds, these different phases that Putin's gone through. The older he gets, the more paranoid he's become. We can see the way his behavior has changed, the way he engages more with President Xi Jinping, for example, different leaders. He's definitely had mindset shifts from when he first took over to then 2008 to maybe 2012, 14 to now the latest one. COVID was not good for Putin and his paranoia levels, definitely.
And Prigozhin has just put that onto another level. So even though there isn't another Prigozhin character, that fear must be there. And of course, what the US has done in Venezuela, what they've done in wiping out, the leadership in Iran. I mean, this isn't going to play well with his psyche. What do you think?
Well, I mean, look, I think this is where it gets nuanced. So if we shift a little bit more towards the broader geopolitical situation, the Venezuelan Operation Absolute Resolve was obviously a remarkable illustration of American military prowess. That's not an endorsement. You just have to objectively recognize that no other country can do what the Americans did so simply, so smoothly, and that's what they're very good at. And obviously that's a massive frustration for the Kremlin, for Putin, because despite his rumblings about Russia being a great power or being the global player, Russia can't do that. They can't even take over Ukraine. So they can't operate at that efficiency, that scale, that magnitude, or that speed. Snatch and grabs, as they're called, right, require meticulous planning. And the Russians are good in, disruption techniques or clandestine operations, right? We know this is why they and the Iranians are arguably even closer than the Chinese and Russians are, because they both use these methods of plausible deniability and proxy networks or whatever to disrupt, right? The whole reason Putin is in Ukraine, you could argue partially, is because he wants to prevent it being part of NATO, and they don't allow a country to join because if it's in a state of conflict. So I think Putin looked at the operation in Venezuela in January with a huge array of frustration. There's a certain admiration between these two both, though. This is the problem, and I think we'll probably come back to in our chat, which is that Trump obviously idolizes or fanaticizes over Putin, this idea of the strongman, that he can recreate what Putin has done in Russia and centralize control, turn America into more of an autocratic or illiberal democracy. And Putin has a certain degree of respect, or maybe just he feels he can take advantage of Trump. That's what this conversation on Monday is all about, right? Trump actively favors Putin over Zelensky. I think that's pretty clear, despite how many times Putin messes Trump around, violates the agreements, or does the complete opposite of what they're talking about in peace talks when they're bombing Ukraine. So
gives Iran intelligence data. I mean, for
or
goodness
does
sake,
that?
it's
Yes,
incredible,
exactly.
yeah.
But to the Iranian thing, well, actually, this is one last point, but about the Venezuelan. But this is where it gets interesting, because Trump obviously appreciates Putin, but at the same time, they have been seizing those shadow tankers. So again, that demonstrates that when push comes to shove, Russia has no ability to do anything. They can't stop what's happening in Iran. They can't do anything. So America seizing the tankers is a conflict versus to what Trump is wanting to do, which is bring Russia into the global economy again. So it's an interesting dichotomy, a bit of a paradox here. On the one hand, they're disrupting Russia's interests, but on the other hand, they're wanting to further them. And then when you come to Iran, what you're talking about there, I mean, ultimately, Putin doesn't really care who leads the government. He had a decent relationship with Khamenei, but that was more from a mutual interest of disruption of Western interests or destabilizing of the Americans. Not so much because they're both, Putin is Christian orthodoxy. It's very different to the theological outlook of the Islamic Republic. So I think Putin is obviously not happy about the situation in Iran, but ultimately he cares more about what can Russia get out of it. Can they get a foothold? That's why he's trying so hard to be the mediator now, and keep some kind of relevancy for Moscow, not just in the globe, but especially in the Middle East, where the Russians have been considered the relative winner in the context of Syria until Assad was ousted. So.
Is this a net gain right now for Russia, or is it a short-term gain because of course, the oil price increase, or is this truly going to be a long-term gain for Putin? What's going on in Iran, of course?
Look, the situation in Iran is changing by the hour. In the past 3 hours, we've now seen, I think, incredibly good. The Europeans, specifically the French and Italians, are leading talks with the Iranians to get greenlit to be able to go through the Strait of Hormuz without being struck. I think that is massive, because it undermines Trump's claim that the Islamic Republic is about to imminently collapse. No, it's not. Has it been battered and bruised? Is it much weaker? Yes, of course, but the system is still functioning, and so the Europeans are exposing that BS. But second, it demonstrates, and I'm a pro-Europeanist very much on my channel. Increasingly, I've made arguments more and more anti-Trump and pro-European. So that is probably the one angle I have, which is a recurring theme. But simply, the Europeans are willing to stick two fingers up to the Trump administration and say, well, we don't care about your war. We don't want anything to do with it. We're going to talk to the Iranians ourselves directly. And that is not something you would have seen being done 5 years ago. They would have, consulted with the Americans at least. So I think that's huge. And generally but that being said, the biggest winner out of this is Russia. Now we can debate about over what time horizon. In the short, medium term, definitely they're winning. $100 a day barrel, 120 at its peak in the past 3 days is nice. But if additional war coffers whatever to the war machine, and I think it's $150 million a day they're making, and this single event has basically recalibrated or resolved or given at least some breathing room for the Russian state, because the economy was really bad at the end of last year. And when the Europeans were talking about freezing those sovereign assets, right, sovereign debt, the Kremlin was really pissed. You can tell when Putin's genuinely pissed off or rattled, because he started talking directly to Europe, threatening Europe, which he doesn't do. He's a man of power politics, right? He only talks to Washington because he considers Ukraine and Europe irrelevant in the great power competition. But the fact that he's threatening Europe demonstrates quite clearly that he sees them as enough of a threat to have to do so. So I think that the situation has grossly pivoted now, and Putin has a lot more income, a lot more money. The longer this war goes on, the more Russia benefits, not just from the higher price levels, but from the overall restructuring of the oil and energy security, right? Qatar cut off its LNG supplies. Much of that goes to Europe. That's a fifth of LNG just off the global market. Who has ample supply? Moscow. Okay, America does too, but you've got, and this is the problem with Europe, which is because it's not a unified front, different countries are arguing about whether they need it or they want it, right? The Spanish do not support what the Americans are doing. The Germans do. The Austrians had continued to import LNG and certain energy from Russia up until 24, and they finally discontinued that. Let's not get started on Hungary or Slovenia. So this benefits Russia regardless of if it's absolute or relative. They're going to be okay for the time being. Does it resolve everything within the country? No. And does it help Putin's war in Ukraine? Not really. The Ukrainians are, doing a remarkable job with the deterrence and the drone interceptors and continued things like that. So it's not like Putin can completely switch off. But in the longer term, it's more nuanced. Because if the Islamic Republic were to be eradicated, then Russia loses a massive geopolitical, strategic, ideological ally. But I don't think they are going to be eradicated. I think this war is possibly the stupidest move that the Trump administration and Israel could have done. But okay. So Putin still has to play his cards right. He still has to make sure that he doesn't overstep. If it becomes very clear that the Russians have been supplying this intelligence, which, let's be honest, they probably have, what would America do? Is Trump just going to be like, well, whatever, they do it to us, say la vie? Then Putin gets off scot-free again. I think the last point I'd make is simply flip it round and think about relative, not from the Russian perspective, but from Ukraine. How much can the Ukrainians leverage this war to their advantage? And we're seeing this with the conversations around drone provisions, advisory to the Gulf states, but possibly even the United States itself. No other country is as advanced and informed about this kind of conflict or modern warfare as it is than Ukraine. So I think that even if it continues, Ukraine can leverage it effectively to support their own industrial base, funding, and general global standing.
Does that mean going directly to the Gulf states? Because there's been some rumors, as it were, that some of the long-standing, large-scale US contracts for security and defense in the Middle East are coming under review, dare I say it, and they may want to go direct to Ukraine. Because while we're on air, two extraordinary statements, I think, have come out. One is Trump, talking to Brian Kilmeade of Fox News, has come out and said, I won't do the accent because that would be vaguely racist, but he come out and he's basically said, we don't need Ukrainian drones because we have the best drones in the world. We make the best drones. We have no need for Ukrainian drones whatsoever. So that's kind of fun. The other one is Hegseth has come out and said possibly the most absurd statement I've ever heard. He said the Straits of Hormuz are entirely open to ship transit, apart from the missiles and drones, which in my book is a little bit of a, that might put me off if I was a ship's captain or a ship's owner. So here we have two extraordinary statements that attest, I think, to the absolute lack of a plan in terms of the US operation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware I've given some lengthy replies. So I'll try to be more concise, but I think this comes back to a central thesis, which is The Americans and Israelis have different strategic objectives. Operationally, they've been, relatively united, but at a strategic level, the Israelis are much more in this long term. This is their existential threat. For them, this is hour zero. This is the day that they've been waiting for so long. And considering that
it's in Netanyahu's case, he's been dreaming of this moment for decades, I believe.
He has, but I always think he wanted to pause. He didn't want to necessarily do it, but he's he's in coalition with the most neoconservative bunch you could possibly, Ben Gvir, Smotrich. These types of people have, well, I find them incredibly unpalatable, but they have these desires for clearly, Israel's broader territorial interests and defense. It's not just about Israel as it is right now, I think. And point being is that America, regardless of administration, have always been slightly more wary, restraint orientated, right? Maybe making calculated, targeted strikes on specific military bases, infrastructure, whatever. But it's the Israelis that want this all-out regime change to effectively make Iran a rump state, right? A former husk of its power, and in many ways it is already after the past 6 months with Operation Rising Lion or Midnight Hammer. But the point is that there's a conflict of interest, there's a divergence of views here between these two, and therefore that is going to be a systemic problem for the continuation of this campaign.
Well, Netanyahu, like Trump, is seeing this also as a way to stay out of jail. He really does. As you know, he's if this war were to end today, the trial will continue, and he has a very good likelihood of going to prison. And that's not just making a joke. And this is a good way for him to stay out of prison. And you're right. I mean, this is existential for Israel. At least they think it is. Netanyahu is selling that to them. And they want to not only defeat Iran and neuter it permanently, I believe that they want to greatly expand Israel's footprint in the area. What do you think about that? At least I think that's what Netanyahu and his far right cohort is trying to do.
This is very difficult for me. It's very delicate. I used to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian war, but then it just became too toxic, and I found myself just not really benefiting from it in terms of my mental state. So I haven't really done much on it in recent months. But look, I support Israel's right to defend itself, and I certainly am glad to see the eradication of Khamenei. But what comes after him now seems worse. And as for Israel's territorial interests, I mean, look, they have undertaken an incursion, a buffer zone, as they call it, into southern West Syria, further than the Golan Heights, which is unrecognized as illegally occupied by everyone, apart from the US, obviously. But what they're doing in Lebanon now, I think one of the biggest sufferers of this entire conflict isn't Iran, well, not only Iran, in Lebanon. Always. Poor country's been decimated by proxy conflicts, economic catastrophe after that 2020 explosion, if you remember, in the port, I think it was in August. The country's really struggled to get a stable footing again because of Hezbollah and stuff. So bottom line, though, Israel is claiming that Hezbollah is threatening them. So they're basically creating another buffer zone up until the river on the, I forget the name of it, Tablani River or something, if that's right. So, you could argue that these are long-standing territorial acquisitions. Under international law, it is considered illegal that you go there, you squat, you occupy, but then you never really leave. Their emphasis is on Lebanon demilitarizing Hezbollah. Well, the Lebanese government have been able to do that for ages, and you're the military force. Why can't you help them with that? So sort of these unfair, I think, conditions, and also the whole analysis done by 18 different intelligence agencies in the United States, which came out very clearly saying that any such operation like they are undertaking against Iran would not work. There is no example in history where aerial power alone has induced effective regime change, let alone behavioral change. So I don't know. I mean, you could argue that, yeah. They do illegally occupy the settlements in the West Bank. That is an encroachment, with the idea that, better to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission, right? Once they've done it, who can stop what? You're going to go there and kick out all the Israelis who have moved into the West Bank, right? So theoretically, yes. I feel obviously very conscious about just explicitly saying it, but there is clearly a desire to expand Israel's physical territory under this government. And this sense of leaning back on the existentialism argument, which, Iran clearly wasn't as much of an existential threat in the past 8 months because they didn't do anything. And they are much more weakened than they were a year and a half ago. Israel's operation against Nasrallah and with the pages, right? Those pages that exploded, right? That was a remarkable intelligence and military operation. And that severely incapacitated the leadership of Hezbollah to the point that they didn't want to get involved in this war. And now suddenly they're getting involved in this war. Makes sense to me. So I feel like Israel does, or this government, I'll differentiate, this government has a bone to pick with so many different groups in the region. They're chomping at the bit to eradicate the Islamic Republic, but therefore are now throwing the entire region into turmoil. And I don't think winning themselves many favors. So, it's a difficult one to answer, to be honest with you, David. But I staunchly understand Israel's perspective, but I also staunchly disagree with this military operation having ever been made in the first place.
Let me just echo what you said at the very beginning. I too strongly support Israel's right to exist. I've been pro-Israel since I've been alive. At least since I knew of its existence. But like you, I think there's a difference between supporting Israel's right to exist and what they're doing recently, what they started to do after the attack in 2023 and how they carried that out in Gaza, and how they've greatly expanded that now and saying that it is an existential fight that they must win. And I think not only illegally occupying territory, not only illegally killing many, many people, but expanding the borders of Israel. I believe this is permanent or long-term unless they're stopped. And it's also amazing to me that both Netanyahu and Trump are echoing the same phrase, that this is an existential fight for them, as if Iran's going to attack the United States here in the homeland and destroy us. But that's what Trump says, and his MAGA base actually believes that. But in this case, Netanyahu is leading him by the nose, and this is not going to be a good outcome for the United States.
No, I've always been skeptical about this or cautious about jumping on the bandwagon like America's completely trolled by Israel, except Zionism and all that sort of stuff. But certainly in this specific context, has America been egged on to get involved or initiate this? Yeah, come on. I think it would be disingenuous to not recognize that. And what I find frustrating about that argument sometimes is that people, if you are critical of Israeli foreign policy or whatever, people who are obviously staunchly pro-Israel or just Israeli will say, oh, so you're anti-Zionist or you're anti-Semitic or something. That's a very lazy and deliberately falsified interpretation. Because you can be critical of Israeli foreign policy, right? My girlfriend is Jewish or partially Jewish. We have these conversations on a frequent basis because it's difficult for some people to distinguish between this. People like to interpret, and it goes with the war in Ukraine as well, things in a very binary sense. They're not. Geopolitics is never binary. It's incredibly gray. And certainly in the Middle East, where it is a concoction of arbitrarily drawn up borders from predominantly the British or French and Russian empires, that lead to the situations that we have now. And so anyone who simply interprets it as being anti this or that is doing themselves a disservice by coming across moronic.
And I dare say Russia, who's had a vested interest and in the Soviet period of pouring petrol on, a fiercely raging fire. It's never hesitated to inject that accelerant into it. And of course, the PLO, to an extent, is partly an invention of the Russian intelligence services in order to, strike back at Western interests, which Israel is perceived to be, a core of Western interests in the region. So I think that rarely gets sort of mentioned in this debate, that actually it's not that everybody's here hoping that this fire is going to die down. No, there are many, many people looking at it, actually seeking to benefit something from it. That comes to my question here is, certainly if the US was egged on by Netanyahu, or even led into this, and in Trump's first term, if you believe some of the people who were adjacent to his first administration or observing it, this topic would often be brought up by John Bolton and a few other absolute hawks on this issue, wanting to pull his first administration into it. And yet there are other people around going like, no, let's steer you away from that. That's a really bad idea, Mr. President. This is why it'll spike oil prices. It'll upset your core base. It'll do this, it'll do that, and manage to talk him out of it. It seems there aren't those figures in the administration at this point to sort of say, hang on a second, do you really want to open this can of worms? My question here is, has Russia been prodding as well? Because Putin finds himself in a very dark place just a few weeks ago, with Urals crude hitting as low as $41 a barrel. Very likely that is below the production transportation costs. And again, if you count the huge discounts that are worked into the sort of operations of the Grey Fleet, they were looking at a huge budget hole and difficulty in extending their war against Ukraine. Suddenly they find themselves in a much better position and potentially have the excuse here for the US to lift sanctions. It's temporary at the moment. That may well actually become more substantial and permanent if let's say Trump can get away with it. Russia is the net beneficiary of this, which leads me to ask the obvious question: was Putin behind the scenes goading for this to happen as well?
Well, when you say goading, do you mean goading to Trump or to Netanyahu?
Both. I believe there are certain channels of connection between the Russian regime and Netanyahu. Not that they have aligned interests on everything, or even, that many things, but I think there are channels of communication. There are maybe certain interests. Very difficult to say, of course, because until those records are released, and they may never be released, we'll probably never know. But it seems to me that it's not impossible that there isn't some kind of alignment or some kind of prodding. Or maybe we're accrediting Putin's regime with far too much strategic nous there.
I mean, no. I mean, my gut reaction is to veer towards your final prognosis, Jonathan. But look, the Israeli-Russian relationship is pretty complicated. Bibi and Putin have a complex relationship. Bibi has tried to centralize power in a way that Putin has done, right? I mentioned it before, but in some people's eyes, Netanyahu's efforts to politicize the judiciary, intimidate certain media, or belittle the opposition. And he has been in power for the best part of 15 years, right? Okay, they've had phases where he's been in and out, but that's a long time, right? Putin's been in power for 25 years, 27 years. So obviously I'm not calling Israel the same as Russia in its system, but the point is that some people think Israel's Bibi is a strongman. And
he's certainly a populist. It's certainly a populist, without question. But does he veer into aspiring strongman? That's a big question. Yeah.
And who is the pin-up strongman? It's Putin. So he's perfected the system that so many others, be it Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Orbán, all that, Trump, we sort of touched upon, have wanted to emulate. But then there's the foreign policy more broadly. Now, Russia's interests in the Middle East have obviously been through certain nodes, specifically Syria. So when the loss of Assad happened, that's a big blow to Moscow, but obviously a big benefit for Israel. So the countries were not exactly congratulatory or chatty when that occurred. But I think that I certainly think that the Russians have been. I would find it difficult to see how Putin would want this war to go ahead unless he really is thinking in, I hate this expression, but 4D chess of like, well, if I get the Americans to attack Iran and then that hikes up the price of oil, but then I can sort of work on Trump to relieve me with sanctions. I mean, I guess, but as I say, like, Putin wasn't benefiting from the shadow fleet being targeted by the Americans, and he's lost Venezuela. So I find it not great for him that he's also losing another potential big partner. So in a roundabout way, you could theorize, but I feel it's quite a big gamble for him. But maybe he's on the back foot so much that he has to make such a big gamble. I certainly think he might have, encouraged Trump in certain ways. You could argue that maybe there were sort of words put in certain places, messaging here, backdoor diplomacy, that sort of thing. But I certainly am not sure that the Russian Federation has overtly been telegraphing to Washington to undertake this campaign. Ultimately, Putin benefits, but I don't know if that's at the end of the day. Also, he's a master strategist, as we like to say. Except he keeps losing.
But clearly not.
But clearly not. So, does he have the capacity to do so? Possibly. Do I think he did? Not really.
One of the most horrific stories that's going around now, and it's probably based on real leaks from the American administration, is that we, the Americans, are going to be putting boots on the ground in Iraq or in Iran, quite possibly special forces initially, landing on Karg Island and some of the other islands within the Persian Gulf. What can you say about that? I mean, it's a tragic story. I've read and seen all of the analysis about what an insane move that would be. But I believe that since our administration here in America is in fact insane, led by a mentally deranged individual, that's pretty much on the table. The fact that we're discussing it, that the Pentagon or whoever is actually putting it out there as a possibility, as a tactical move, is insane in a war. But the fact is, I think that's what's going to happen. What are your thoughts on that? I think I know, but I've got to hear it from you anyway.
Oh, goody. This is one of my favorite bits because I think it's so absurd. Let's just do some math, for example. So the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, they are ideologically driven, motivated. They are, they're not just a standard military. They are in the economic system. They are, many people think that they really run the show more than Khamenei or Ali Khamenei did, but there's about 150,000 of them. Then you've got the besieged militia, right? This sort of component, which are a little bit more loosely defined, but they are super active as well. They're about 100,000 strong. And then you've got the Artesh, the conventional actual military, which is more about the domestic situation, whilst the IGC does more of the foreign stuff, interference. That's about 300,000, according to some estimations. So even if we pretend that there are defections, desertions, the conscripts don't want to fight, we're talking about 300, 400,000 troops. That's a sizable opposition force you're going to have to take on. And what is the Trump administration's, the perceived approach that they're thinking? Limited war or ground operation, predominantly made up of Kurdish forces, Iranian Kurdish forces, and maybe they're supported by air campaign. I mean, this is not a scenario that is going to work in their favor, right? Look at what the Gulf War was. You had 50 plus nations, a comprehensive military operation of ground assets, navy, aerial, intelligence, whatever. We're talking about a fraction of that against a country 3 times the size in territory and even bigger than that in population. Now, again, we can talk about, the Iranian people decide to get involved. Considering the lengths that the the regime went to treat their own people in January, I don't think you're going to get massive people rising up, and we aren't seeing that. Even today, protests or gatherings for the Quds movement, or whatever it's called, were there on the streets, despite rockets and bombs going off in the background of some footage I saw. So this is a ludicrous idea that cannot have any feasibility of working. To make it worse, the Syrian Kurds, because obviously different Kurds that occupy different parts of different nations, have openly said, don't do it to the Iranian Kurds. That's not a good start. And of course, we don't know how the Americans would seek to undertake this. Are they going to put in special forces? Are they going to send in a limited operation of conventional forces as well? Where are they going to land them? Why would you tell people that you're doing this? Why would you leak this kind of information? And also, what's your time horizon? What are the goals here? What, to occupy and sort of control northern, western Iran? Well, what's Azerbaijan going to say about the Azerbaijani Iranians? What is the Iranian? Because, and this is the other thing, it stimulates a lot of national sentiment, right? The Iranian people are a very old civilization, Persians, and you get this idea of the Persian nationality flaring up, and therefore that becomes very anti any sort of separatist group, right? It's not about minorities, it's about Iran as a whole, and especially when they're on the receiving end of these rockets and explosions, toxic rain, which is being dropped upon them after Israel strikes on the oil refineries and stuff in Tehran. So I think that this idea of I don't know too much about the island, if I'm honest. I think it's I look at it more as a component within this broader discussion around ground forces or sort of operation. I don't see how it could. I don't see how it's feasible. I just don't understand. We haven't seen, we haven't seen the kind of military buildup or movement that would be required for something like we saw with Iraq, right? It took months and months of preparation to undertake a full-scale operation campaign.
Pistol Pete and King Don really don't know anything about Iraq. I mean, I'm very serious. They don't know the history. They don't know the military. They don't know the terrain. They don't know the people. They don't know anything about this, and so they don't care. What's been telegraphed already, and this isn't a secret, is that again, special forces would land on Karg Island. They may be then later supported by an insertion of the 82nd Airborne, where nobody knows. And if that didn't work, which it won't, further supplemented by other ground troops, other American Army divisions. We don't have anywhere near that many people in theater. We don't have them. The Marines, the closest Marines, I believe, are in the Philippines. Why? We don't know. We don't have any minesweepers there. Why? They haven't thought about it. I think they're actually being renovated right now, repaired and upgraded. Why? Nobody thought about this. Karg Island, and if you study this, Karg Island, the biggest island in the Straits of Hormuz, is overshadowed by all the mountains in Iran, right there on the coast. Even if the special forces did land there and overtake all of the defenses on Karg Island, they would be shelled. They would be targeted 24 hours a day. There's no way to escape this. This is insane. There is no plan. It just amazes me.
No, but to that point, David, like, this whole threat of demining or mining the Strait of Hormuz, right? Bottom line, people need to understand, if it isn't clear already, is that Iran doesn't need to win this war. They can't outright beat the United States of America. That's obvious. All they have to do is outlast them. Asymmetrical warfare, applying specific pressure on decisive points, as Napoleon called it, in the energy area, in Gulf states and their tourism infrastructure, in American bases. You've lost another 6 personnel because of this war, completely unnecessarily. So they need to do the bare minimum. They everyone's talking about the drop off of missile usage. That's deliberate. They're not going to use all their missiles within the first 2 days. They're settling in for a protracted conflict, for a long war. And if the Americans were to sort of go into the Strait of Hormuz to have to demine it, they're sitting ducks. It's not a big body of water. It's a narrow waterway where directly overlooking Iranian territory, where they can then be bombed the hell out of, let alone the fact that demining to bring Ukraine back into it, right? It's one report from CSIS a year ago said that it would take upwards of 30 years to demine eastern Ukraine because of what the Russians have put there with the dragon's teeth, the whole trenches as well. It's completely destroyed part of eastern Ukraine's, where all the prosperous fields were for agriculture, let alone access to precious minerals and metals and so on. So you try to demine aqua mines, demine mines that are in the water, that's even harder. So the more I think about it, the more, if anything, funny it is that the Trump administration think that this is somehow a feasible endeavor.
And coming back to my comment earlier about we don't need Ukrainian interception, again, Iran has an extraordinary strength here, which is that it can churn out 10, 20 times more shaheeds per month than the US can possibly hope to churn out. The PAC-3 interceptors or the Patriot interceptors, and of course those cost 1,000 times more than the shaheeds to churn out.
2,000.
So in terms of a huge
4 million
disparity.
to 20K, it's nuts.
You often 20K versus whatever 3 million or whatever.
Jonathan, it's more than that. Sorry, I'll stop interrupting, but I just want to make, because for people, the intercept drone, right? You might need more than one to guarantee that the threat is taken out. So you're talking $8 million for 20K one drone. And I was reading a report in the Wall Street Journal earlier, or just before we jumped on air with you, which is that the American intelligence community, the Pentagon, is like, some people estimate last year America made 600 and something interceptors over the whole year, and some people
Correct.
And some people reckon that more than 1,000 have been used in the first 2 weeks of this campaign.
Yeah,
it's unsustainable.
And Iran can churn out 700 apparently shaheeds a month. Also, the impact, I think, is something that the US planners, if there were indeed any planners on this, haven't figured out. Because all you need is to get one of those into the Burj Al Khalifa, or get a few of these a week going into Dubai, and you have cost billions in lost real estate deals, in foreigners fleeing, lost investment. So again, the low cost of impact versus the economic pain you can inflict, there's an extraordinary disparity there. Not least closing the Strait of Hormuz as well to 20% of global oil traffic.
No, I think that's a really important point. I posted a video yesterday on the channel about the butterfly effect, right? The compounding, that this isn't just about oil prices. It's about the volatility surrounded with the whole markets. Markets don't mind, okay, it's at a sustained high level, but at least it's consistent. What's worse if it's changing every day because people don't know what to do. So couple that with we're now going to see sustained inflationary pressure, especially in the UK or Italy, where I was last week for some conferences. This is not cool for the long-standing economic sustainability of the global economy, and ultimately the reputational effect it has on Dubai, or this haven of safety and freedom, or et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's all the British crypto dudes who've come back, finance bros who've come back to the UK. No, it's terrible.
And Gulf states are going to be getting very thirsty very soon, because Iran took out the desalination plant in Qatar, and they depend on this. This isn't just some hobby or going green. They need this to drink. And it's going to be the same for a lot of the Gulf states, and that's not getting enough attention, in my opinion. Sure, the oil is the big story, but fresh drinking water in the Gulf states, the Middle East, is huge. And when you take that away, and I understand they only got maybe 30 to 60 days worth of desalinated water before this becomes a crisis, that's not a good thing either.
No, as I say, it comes back to the pressure point, or pressure on decisive points, because the Iranians just need to hit very specific targets to create a disproportionate impact. The Iranians have built up a certain degree of insulation to this. Like the Russians are sort of, to quote, is it Konstantin, all right, who we have on the show, our respective shows, Jonathan, right? Konstantin Samaliev. Russians are professional sufferers. They like to, they have this mindset of endurance, that in hardship, we will endure the conflict in Ukraine because we're used to it, and we will not be defeated or punished by the West, that sort of mentality. But the same with the Iranians, in that they are insulated to this. They're used to being on the receiving end of sanctions, different kind of warfare by the US or whoever it is, whilst the Gulf states are not as much. Dubai has very good interceptors or defensive capabilities, I think, has been proven. But clearly, the countries have received more than they expected, and it's making them uncomfortable.
And they're running out of those interceptors very, very fast. The United States pulled its THAAD ballistic missiles out of South Korea, which is also not a very good thing. We are running out. The United States, the Gulf states are going to be running out very, very soon. This is a tragedy. It's not a tragedy waiting to happen. This is a tragedy that's only getting worse.
Dare I say, if we zoom out even further, and I guess we're going to have to wrap up soon, but if we zoom out even further, what is the China view on this? Now, they've condemned Iran for striking various states. China doesn't necessarily like global instability, and it certainly doesn't like the idea of global recession, because that's going to be an existential threat to the regime. However, if the US is running short of these capabilities and munitions, and if the American public are once again going to be back in the mind frame of don't get involved in foreign wars, which I think that will harden even further after this disaster, what are the implications for Taiwan? Does that give a green light for China to move ahead with the invasion of Taiwan?
Yeah, so I see in the comments there, Radical Bite has asked. Yes, it is Konstantin Samalyov of Inside Russia, who I'm referencing, and ironically, he invited me for a live stream yesterday on his channel. He said it was the first one he's ever done, so that was quite exciting. But it was all about Russia, China, and how does China see Russia, Russia seeing China, etc. And I think that a lot of people don't appreciate the nuances around China. People just see, oh, China wants to take over the world, or it wants to become the US 2.0. Not necessarily. Some people argue that China wants to be called what's known as a status quo power. That, to your point, Jonathan, that the Chinese benefit from the system as it is, which is why when I see them put in the same context, or what's known as the axis of upheaval, that they're the same as the Russians, the North Koreans, the Iranians. They're not. They have this common desire to see the world more balanced or multipolar, but it's not as simple as the Chinese are, wanting to disrupt it. They don't. They benefit from the current system as it is, and that's why when the Iranians and the Russians do these sorts of things, the war in Ukraine was beneficial for China in some ways, but it was also a massive shock to the economy, which China didn't appreciate. So in this regard, it's in the context of the war in Iran, China, the Russians have been providing the intelligence. They will go to further extents to support their strategic partner than the Chinese will. But the Chinese have interests in this, and certainly the consistent provision of oil. But I think it's not so much about that, because the Chinese are relatively sheltered from this. They have reserves. They've also been expending a massive amount of money and time on, being self-sufficient, renewables, all that sort of stuff. So they're certainly wary of the situation. But from my understanding, the ships that haven't been impeded from going through the Strait of Hormuz are either Chinese or Russian. So China is wary of this, but they, as always, will preach the same sort of thing: non-interference or non-intervention, territorial integrity, which of course is ironic for the Chinese to say that over certain, the 7-dash line in the South Asian theater, and Taiwan, of course. But I think it's more about the ideological contagion. I made a video of this last week, which was proven to be quite popular, which simply was talking about that the Chinese don't like when systems like theirs are under threat, because they worry about the idea that this could be contagious for their own system. China relies on that one-party state system, on the centralized structure, much like the Islamic Republic, albeit for different ideological purposes. But if the Iranian people get a sense that maybe we should challenge the system, well, then what's to stop different Chinese communities from feeling the same, or minority groups in China? So I think that's where they often look at it most concerned. And as for Taiwan, I mean, look, I think it comes back to this this idea of military preparation. China's not ready to move on Taiwan. We would have to see a massive military buildup. Just 2 months ago, there was a massive purge in the PLA, or the People's Liberation Army, of the most senior general at the head of the whole thing. He was purged along with some of his deputies, which was pretty unusual. Never really seen anything like that in the CCP before. So, in my opinion, I don't think this is. Well, certainly it gives China the awareness that, you know, America might be expending its military, you know, assets or arsenal right now. But I think it also demonstrates that they are aware that the Americans can be pretty well, you know, they've got stuff in Venezuela still. They have the ability to project paranoia that China is getting better at, but still not the same level. You know, China has 2 military bases. America has upwards of 800, whether you like it or not. So there's a long time for them to get ready. And I think this idea that they could be ready to move in the next couple of years is still, we're going to have to see an uptake in military activity for that to happen. But certainly from a principled standpoint of what this event means in Iran for China, they're taking notes and leveraging it to their advantage in a rhetoric sense.
And I think we're going to have to wrap it up with that. Piotr, thank you so much for joining us. And it is great to see you again after almost 2 years. So congratulations on your channel and on your Substack. Jonathan posted the links to both of those. We encourage people to go there and see what you have to say, which is quite a bit. Thank you very much. Jonathan, stay on after this. I want to get a few words. Other than that, Piotr, have a good rest of your day, and let's not stay strangers again.
No, let's do it again. Let's have you on the show. And thanks very much for everyone watching and listening to my very lengthy answers, I'm aware. But take care, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye. Great insight. Good to speak again.
Take care.